everyone. We have been through a lot on this campaign. When we got started, we started in places like Frederick, Maryland, and things like that. Now, we'll go over all that in a second, but you might notice to my left a familiar face. Or, if you've only followed along with our podcast via your ears, you might know this guy in a minute when he starts speaking. But ladies and gentlemen, to our left is a legend in the historical community, and he's still quite a young man. So this guy is going to absolutely light the industry on fire for years and years and decades to come. But to my left is the very first guest we ever had here on the History of Things podcast. This is Kevin Pollak, who is an extraordinaire, just like Matt, when it comes to the Maryland campaign. And we missed him. We hadn't hung out with him in a really long time. We're coming up on season 4, so we wanted to get him involved here at Shepherdstown. But first, bud, how have you been? What you working on? How have things been going with you?
Oh gosh, how many projects too many projects to name. You know how that goes, I'm
Absolutely.
sure. Yeah. Still Maryland campaign stuff though since the last podcast. So it's good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. It was quite a pleasure. You know, we wanted to get started with the show someplace comfortable. We were comfortable with the story. Thought we knew everything. Even the guy that does this daily, you blew our minds, man. It was absolutely incredible. We still get a ton of great feedback about our very first episode, so thank you. So let's sort of peel the onion, you know, and sort of look at where we've been, right? I mentioned that we've been a lot of places since this whole, you know, campaign started 160 years ago on September 4th, 1862, right? We were at White's Ford. Lee was crossing the river into Maryland, invading the North for the first time. From there, we went to Frederick, Maryland. We followed Lee as he sort of divided the army and sent it to go sort of seize Harper's Ferry and position itself, you know, in the gaps around Boonesboro, Maryland. Before we jumped into that story, we did a whole lot of little story focuses. We went to places like just outside Dickerson, Maryland, the Monocacy Aqueduct. We hung out with John G. Walker as he tried to blow up the aqueduct itself. We went to Sugarloaf. Unsuccessfully, for sure. You can still see it today. That's what's in. It's in the shot. That's the real one. It's not a reconstruction. We went to Sugarloaf Mountain, where we followed the Union Signal Corps as they let the first sort of, you know, knowledge of this pass to Washington that Lee has moved into Maryland. We went to Hyattstown. Yep. We watched the sort of first contact of this campaign be made, right? We had a line established along that ridge. One of the first major ridges coming north out of D.C. is right around Hyattstown, Maryland, and that's where Confederate pickets will run into some of the advanced elements of the Federal pursuit, which...
And true to form, Pat tells us about a party down there at the Landon House in Urbana.
I was going to say, which leads us to a huge party. Jeb Stuart is really rocking and rolling up in Urbana, and, you know, he is made aware among the first that this aggressive federal pursuit has begun. Remember, we focused a lot on this too, guys, right? We know that McClellan is not sitting on his laurels. There's a lot of that being thrown around with McClellan even before this campaign has truly begun. They talk critically about him getting out of Washington, but 3 days, and then considering what is accomplished, you know, with 2 plus 3 commands morphing to 1,
right?
It's a busy 3 days, and he's moving, and he catches them pretty quick. From there, we went back to Frederick and caught up with those armies as they were sort of touching as they arrived and left Frederick, Maryland. From there, we jumped over to South Mountain. We covered the federal arrival against the defenses in the gaps.
All 4 of them.
All 4 of them, true. We went to it. Frosttown is a gap. Don't forget. Hashtag Frosttown. From there, you know, we followed Lee and Longstreet as they, you know, retreated out of the Boonesboro area and started to form around Sharpsburg, Maryland. And then we jumped over and caught up with General Thomas Jonathan Jackson, who was in the process of seizing Harper's Ferry. We have been a lot of places.
That we have.
We finally concluded this, or so we think, when we were out at Antietam just a couple days ago. We followed the single bloodiest day in American military history through the sort of traditional 3 phases, but as you'll hear, if you go back and listen, and if you've listened on our show, we don't really do the 3 phases thing anymore. There's some pretty continuous action the entire day. And for most people, that seems to be where the story ends, is Lee retreating off the field. But as we covered leaving the field ourselves that day, the 18th and the 19th are eventful.
Absolutely.
McClellan is beginning a pursuit, as Matt touched on. So Matt, take us through, again, just a small refresher on this, you know, aftermath, I guess you could say, of Antietam, because everybody thinks September 17th is the end of the show.
Right.
But it's not. So take us through the next 2 days or so, and then bring us to where we are and why Kevin is hanging out with us.
Sure. Well, I can definitely do that, Pat. The 18th of September, both armies are like 2 wounded animals, glaring at each other, waiting for the other side to flinch. They're both preparing their forces for a continuation of the engagement. Both armies think this fight's going to continue. However, by midday on September 18th, Lee is going to quietly begin sending his wounded and his supply wagons back towards the river that we're standing next to, the Potomac, to begin crossing back into what was still Virginia at that time. We're actually on the West Virginia shore now.
Go Mountaineers.
That evening, Lee is going to tell his troops in lines of battle to build up bonfires there at Antietam National Battlefield, what becomes the National Battlefield, and then very quietly his forces will begin to slip away. And all through that night, Confederate forces would be retreating, actually passing over the Potomac River into what was still Virginia at that point by dawn the next day. Now, of course, one of the great misunderstandings of George McClellan is that there was no pursuit of Lee. But of course, we know that Federal forces do advance on the 19th. They find those Confederate lines empty, and they will let McClellan know that it appears that Lee has flown. He will unleash his cavalry, and it would be Union cavalry that go charging down Route 34, what is known then as the Boonesboro Pike, coming down here to the Potomac River. And I want to turn it over to our guest at this point, Kevin Pollock. Kevin is probably the most well-researched historian on this fight, on the Battle of Shepherdstown. I would say number one.
Number one. Number one in our hearts and minds and on our lives.
The hearts and minds part I might agree with.
There you go.
Thank you.
But I do want to turn it over to you, Kevin, to kind of get us into what becomes known as the Battle of Shepherdstown, September 19th and 20th, 1869.
Yeah, so as Matt and Pat were talking about, with the fighting at Shepherdstown and the fighting at Antietam, just to draw, again, a bigger picture, I mean, you read most of the general histories of the Maryland campaign, or really of the entire Civil War, and you're right, it ends on September 18th. Lee goes back across the Potomac River. It's over.
Yep.
And then
End
the
of
Army
story.
sit around for a while. About 650 soldiers that become casualties here on the banks of the Potomac River would tell you a very different story, certainly. Largest fight entirely in the state of West Virginia. Here, about 10,000 soldiers will be engaged. Of course, Harper's Ferry is a mixture of the two. But also the bloodiest fight within the current confines of the state of West Virginia takes place here along the banks of the Potomac River, about a mile downstream from Shepherdstown. And you might be able to see in the distance the modern railroad bridge. There you go, Pat, get out of the way. That carries a post-Civil War railroad across the Potomac River. But just beyond that sits Shepherdstown. Now, we're along the Potomac River on the south bank of the river, and just about 100 yards in front of us is Boatler's Ford, that crossing point that carried Lee's army, some portions of Lee's army, into Maryland, right after Harper's Ferry on their way to Antietam, and then it will carry the entirety of Lee's army back out of Maryland and back here into Virginia, as Matt talked about the night of September 18th and 19th. So by 10 a.m. on September 19th, Lee's entire army was across. And this is where the story has typically ended again, that it's over.
He's in Virginia, guys. What's more to talk about?
That's right, exactly. We know from 3 letters that Robert E. Lee wrote within a week's time span of him crossing the Potomac River here that he had a very specific purpose for doing it. It was not to come back into Virginia and stay here. His campaign in Maryland was not over as far as Robert E. Lee was concerned. He wanted to take his army, move it south from the Potomac River, swing west to Martinsburg, and then north to Williamsport. That would be the main body of his army, the infantry and artillery, and then recross the Potomac River at Williamsport, behind a screen of his cavalry that would be basically a lightning strike force to secure a bridgehead there at Williamsport. And then Lee's army, if he caught McClellan off guard, might be able to get to Hagerstown, where it could either turn south and strike McClellan at Sharpsburg, could move east and threaten Baltimore and Washington, or it could move north into Pennsylvania. So there's still a lot left on the table for Lee's army at this point.
This is an incredible amount of I still intend on doing this for a narrative that we traditionally end at this river crossing. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think for Lee, why he's continuing to go forward is, I always view Lee, he's the poker player that's going all in on this campaign. He's throwing everything he has into this campaign, and I don't think Lee's willing to give it up until he's literally exhausted every other option. In terms of why people, I think, forget about this, even if they know the story, they read Lee's letters back to Jefferson Davis. I was given a talk about Shepherdstown to a roundtable one time, and I gave this whole talk, 45 minutes, 50 minutes. First question, guy raised his hand in the front, and he says, "Yeah, so what?" So if Lee had gotten to Williamsport, what would he have done? His army was in bad shape. And I said, "That's true, sir, but it doesn't mean Lee didn't try it."
Right.
And who knows, ultimately. There's greater upset stories going on in the history of the world than Lee's army getting beat up at Antietam and recrossing into Maryland and seeing what he can do.
Crazier things have happened.
Crazier things have happened,
sure.
absolutely. So you never know. So Lee absolutely tried it. And so that's where most of his army is on September 19th, as they are continuing marching away from the Potomac River to then recross the Potomac River, where we're standing about 13 miles upstream at Williamsport.
Now, Kevin, Lee has sent that strike force you were mentioning up that way already, correct?
Yes, correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So that's Jeb Stuart and the boys?
Yeah, Jeb
Okay.
Stuart. He has the 2nd Virginia Infantry, 11th Georgia, and a couple of other artillery batteries with him.
Gotcha.
At that point. So, yeah, so Stuart is recrossed at Williamsport by September 19th. And there is, little known fact, but there's actually a marker indicating where Stuart fights some federal troops up there along Route 11 between Hagerstown and Williamsport that probably nobody goes by. Well, people live right by it, so
Go
plenty of
find
people
it and see
That's
it.
right.
gonna
I'm
go
not going to
find
tell
it.
you exactly
I know.
where
I
it
didn't know
is.
about it. I'm going to
Yeah,
find it too.
I stumbled on it
Thanks,
one day.
Kevin.
Absolutely. We'll do a next shoot from there.
There you go.
Talking about the lost battle of Williamsport.
Let's go.
like
People
it.
in Williamsport are like, thanks for remembering us.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Other than 63.
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
that's
That's,
right.
that's where all the interpretation goes, is 63, right?
Oh, God.
Unfortunately. But Lee was of the opinion, he admitted this after the war, he thought he had, and this is crazy to think of, but for Robert E. Lee, he believed he had beaten McClellan's army so badly at Antietam that he didn't think McClellan would be able to pursue it. And so with that,
Silly
Lee
dream.
set up, yeah, right.
Silly
Lee set up rear guard here at the Potomac River, guarding Boatler's Ford. That wasn't that large of a force.
Right.
I mean, it was impressive in terms of its artillery makeup. It was
Yeah, it's
44.
got a lot of firepower.
Yeah, 44 pieces of artillery,
Wow.
600 infantry, made up in 2 brigades. Lewis Armistead's brigade, who's not commanding the brigade here because he's been wounded at Antietam,
Right.
and Marcellus Douglas's brigade, who's also not commanding the brigade here at Antietam because he's dead at this
Dead.
point.
I was going to say, really dead.
Yeah,
Very,
yeah, very
very
much
dead.
so. Yeah,
Super dead.
and then there's some cavalry of Thomas Munford's brigade that's mixed in as well.
Hmm.
But all of this was under the command of William Nelson Pendleton, who's Lee's chief of artillery. Pendleton's star has been plummeting
Womp.
by this point of the Maryland campaign.
You
Really
mean the
by Civil
Rockbridge
War.
Artillery?
That's right, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That Pendleton, though, you're right. But Pendleton was a graduate of the United States Military Academy in 1830, was in the Army for a year, and then proceeded to basically bankrupt many different Episcopal parishes as he was the rector of those, including one in Frederick, actually.
Oh.
I don't know if he bankrupted that one. He did several, though. But not looking good for Pendleton.
No.
But when Lee reorganized his army following the 7 days, Pendleton had 27 artillery batteries directly under his command as part of the Army's reserve artillery.
Wow.
By the time of the Maryland campaign, he's down to 4. So,
Okay.
again, you know, what's the best way to eliminate somebody?
Yeah.
Someone who, like Pendleton, who has friends in high places, including Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. You just kind of give him nothing to do
Yeah.
and let him fade away.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, sort of what Lee was doing at this point. But I think that's also why he entrusts Pendleton with the rear guard, is because he doesn't expect anything to happen here.
He's like, you got it, dude.
Yeah, yep, you're right, yep. So one of my favorite quotes about Pendleton comes from one of Pendleton's men. And he says, Pendleton is like the elephant. We have him and we don't know what on earth to do with him, and it costs a devil of a sight to feed him.
Wow.
So takes a lot of energy from the collective
Burn!
energy from
Sick burn!
the ANV to really deal with Pendleton, I guess. So because of Pendleton's fading star and not really all that well trusted, he was given 2 very specific instructions about what he was supposed to do here on September 19th. First part of that is, if it's just enemy artillery and cavalry across the way, and if they don't cross the river, stay here until nightfall, then fall back. Rejoin the main body of the army, leaving behind just a small force here. If it's enemy artillery, cavalry, and infantry that tries to come across the river, then Pendleton is supposed to hold out until nightfall and then take his entire rear guard back with him to rejoin Lee's army.
So he's supposed to hold regardless.
Yes, hold
Okay.
until nightfall.
Got it.
Yep. Now that's,
Either way,
that's gonna be
stay
important.
here.
Yes, right, exactly. Very good. Yep. So 10 a.m., the last body of the Army of Northern Virginia makes their way across the river. They start heading south on what was the Charlestown Road back then. It's today's Trough Road, not too far from where we are, to eventually link up to some by roads to then take towards Martinsburg and Williamsport. But by 10 a.m., the entire army's across. Lee's pulled off really a minor miracle, getting his army back across the river in the middle of the night in the face of a still dangerous enemy.
Extremely dangerous enemy.
So as Lee gets across, the Federals are trying to figure out where Lee went. The best way to do that is send out your cavalry under Alfred Pleasanton. So Pleasanton's cavalry reaches the bank of the Potomac River, again about a mile west of us, a place called Ferry Hill that's directly opposite of Shepherdstown today. Probably many of you have driven past it. Probably none of you have stopped at it, or very few at least, I should say. But as soon as Pleasanton gets up there with his cavalry, they come under artillery fire from Pendleton's 44 guns. Pleasanton immediately deploys 3 batteries. Pendleton still has the upper hand.
Right.
And so Pleasanton calls for help.
44 guns. Pleasanton's like, that's obviously a big deal. That's not
Yeah.
a little thing over there if we're getting hit with 44 guns.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And Pleasanton
That's like
complained
playing
about...
your hand.
Yeah,
We're
absolutely.
here. We're here entirely.
Yep, yeah. Pleasanton said any position he took, there's always a crossfire on it.
Okay.
So these guns are pretty well sighted, to Pendleton's credit.
All right.
And his subordinates' credit as well. So Pleasanton's gone. He's out of here because he needs help. And
Right.
eventually, after a few different units will show up to help, the one that sticks around is Fitzjohn Porter's 5th Corps, which
There you
is
go.
admittedly one of my favorites. I'll say my bias here. This is actually how I got into the 5th Corps, was studying this battle.
Okay.
But Porter's instructions are pretty much the exact same as Pleasanton's. Don't go across the river unless you see an opportunity to do damage to the enemy. So Porter brought up most of his artillery that stretched along the north bank of the river, along the Maryland bank. This artillery duel commences throughout most of the early afternoon of September 19th. And then as it started getting darker, Porter started putting some of his infantry in the dry bed of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal on the north bank of the river. Included in that infantry was the 1st United States Sharpshooters, who are excellent at picking out the gunners of Pendleton's command. So they're having to deal with that. And things are getting worse for Pendleton as well at this point. Firstly, he was, as Douglas Southall Freeman famously put it, Pendleton failed to count his men. He was not aware of how many men he had under his command, how few men, I should say, he had under his command. So
He
that's
thinks he
problem.
has a larger force than he really has?
Yes.
Or
Yep.
he, okay.
Yeah, he thinks he has a larger force.
Interesting.
So nobody really, I don't think anybody in the Confederate Army really knew the strength of these 2 brigades that were with him at this point.
Well, I mean, there's not a lot of moments, not too many moments you could stop and take stock between
Right.
quitting at the field at Antietam and arriving at this moment. Like,
Correct, yep.
That's the quote-unquote luxury of the next few weeks, is we can stop and take stock.
Yes.
We're not there yet.
No, not at all. They're still doing all this on the fly.
So we got
Very much.
1,000 guys, right? And there's like 10 guys who are like, totally,
Yeah,
just go.
Just
go.
magnify it,
Yeah,
right? There you
just
go. That's all you need.
Don't ask questions.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So Pendleton is getting all these rumors of Federals trying to cross to his left, Federals trying to cross downstream to his right, and he's constantly sending men, sending parties down to check this out. And what ends up happening is he's weakening his force
He's
right here
by
at the ford.
himself in the middle.
Yeah, pretty much.
Hey,
Almost,
guys.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And so Pendleton is in trouble. Also at this point, his artillerists are starting to tell him, we're out of ammunition. What do you want us to do? And now here, I mean, you do kind of have to feel for Pendleton a little bit. He's caught between a rock and a hard place.
Right.
His orders are to hang out until nightfall. It's not yet nightfall. But his gunners are out of ammunition. So what does he do? He ultimately decided, worrying that if his guns started pulling off the bluffs on the Virginia side, that would be a sign to the Federals that they're withdrawing, and that might be an incentive to the Federals to cross
To
the river,
pursue.
to come
Right.
on over. Right. So what Pendleton ordered his artillerists to do was to stay in their positions, even though they couldn't shoot. Just maintain their location.
Just be bullet magnets.
That's right, exactly.
Oh.
Well, that shows the Federals that there's an opportunity here. And so Fitzjohn Porter sent 400 men down to the canal bed. The 1st United States Sharpshooters, about 60 men, and about 300 men of the 4th Michigan Infantry.
Yeah.
There you go. 4th Michigan was like Porter's waterborne infantry.
Are you
These
from
guys-
Michigan? I forgot.
Yeah,
would've
I know,
thunk it.
right? There's more Michiganders here, but you know.
Hey,
Ah,
come on.
We'll touch on
That's
Michigan later.
All right, yeah, I'm standing too close to the river. I don't
Yeah,
want to say too
exactly.
much. But the 4th Michigan, 1st U.S. Sharpshooters, right at about dusk, cross the river. Sharpshooters get lucky; they hit the ford. 4th Michigan does not hit the ford, to be sure, and they come into the water up to their
I
necks.
say it's really deep here, sir.
Yeah, right. So, incredibly, despite that slowing down their advance, there's only a handful of Federals that are casualties in the fight, or in the charge across the river here. And what it serves to do is it starts scattering Pendleton's command. So what Pendleton ended up doing, as soon as he's back at his command post, about a half mile from the river or so, as soon as he starts seeing Confederate troops fleeing to the rear, he goes with them
Yeah.
and gets out of here. So Pendleton throughout the night will ride asking for help, believing, because he's gone before all the artillery has gotten off the field, believing all 44 guns of his command have been captured.
No.
That's a problem, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So he goes to find Roger Pryor, division commander, asks him for help. Pryor says, no, can't help you. John Bell Hood says the same thing. D.H. Hill says the same. D.R. Jones says the same thing. Finally, shortly after midnight, now we're into September 20th, Pendleton found Stonewall Jackson. Tells Jackson what happened. Jackson
spit out his peach and was like, "You're goddamn right, it's time to fight. Let's get your guns."
And he did essentially do that. He starts getting his men ready.
They took your what?
To Boatler's Ford. Though, weirdly enough, a fun Jackson story. He mentions Boatler's Ford, and his commanders say, "What Ford?" They don't know. They don't know the name of the ford here.
Oh my goodness.
So Jackson, you know.
What do you think the sort of on the human level? You've got all these commanders that are being asked, "Hey, come bail me out." Like, think about how awkward this is. Hey, dude, might have got 44 guns captured.
Well,
what?
Roger Pryor's taken over for R.H. Anderson, was he wounded or killed?
Anderson, wounded.
Okay, so he was wounded. He's taken over a division that gets friggin' wrecked at the Bloody Lane.
Yep.
What was the second one he ran into?
Hood.
John Bell Hood, of course, his division gets wrecked up in the cornfield.
That's right.
D.H. Hill.
Daniel Harvey Hill, same story, down at Sunken Road. And then finally Jackson?
Yeah.
And
D.R. Jones.
And D.R. Jones, of course.
Yeah.
So none of these commands are in great shape as Pendleton is trying to find some help. So I can kind of understand.
I know, but it's just like, dude, that's awkward. You lost 44 guns.
Yeah, right. And I think too,
I don't want to be
have
involved.
to wonder.
Yeah, I don't want to touch that.
Yeah, how many of those guys know? You know, I've always wondered this. How many of them know that their plan is to continue marching? That you don't want to turn the army around.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want to be the one responsible for that. But then also, it's like, oh, Matt, I'm sorry, that's your problem though.
That's right.
That's what I mean.
I'm not gonna. I don't want to be.
I'm sure a lot
I don't
of
want to
them
help you out and then get blamed for this too.
I mean, let's be real, right? People are people. A lot of people are probably aware of Pendleton's sort of like, let's put him out here reputation.
Yeah.
So
sure,
when they are starting to be asked about this, a lot of them are probably like, oh my god, dude. Like you couldn't make this you made it worse. I didn't think this was possible.
Yeah,
like,
right. Yeah, it's just like, oh man, he screwed up.
44 guns is a lot, guys.
Yep.
Artillery and horse.
Yeah, right. Yes, absolutely. So finally, shortly after midnight, Pendleton finally found the one guy that could do anything about all this, and that was the Army commander, Robert E. Lee. Now you have to think, for the first time in a little while, Lee's getting an actual night of sleep.
Right.
You know, as close as an Army commander in the Civil War could get to that.
Right.
And here comes Pendleton. Talks to one of Lee's staff officers. Lee's staff officer wakes Lee up, says, General Pendleton's here. He has some information for you. Lee comes out, probably rubbing the sleep from his eyes still, and Pendleton says that he's lost all 44 guns of the artillery reserve back here at the ford.
And Lee just punches him in the face.
Not quite.
That would have been amazing.
Yeah,
just punches him in the face.
That would have hurt his wrist, though, I guess.
That's true.
Yeah. He would have kicked him, I guess. But Lee, shocked, probably even not even half awake at this point. All he can do is say, all? And Pendleton says, yes, General, I fear all. And Lee says, well, there's nothing more we can do about this until the morning. So Lee went back into his tent, grabbed some sleep for probably not too long before he started issuing orders. Right. And then Pendleton went to go sleep in a hay bale for the
duration of the war.
Evening. Yeah, right, yeah. Lee probably would have wished.
Oh my God.
But for the Federals, once they got across here, what they actually found between their actual crossing on the 19th and then they'd go back to the north side of the night of the 19th and then they'd return the morning of the 20th to pick up whatever else they could, they found not 44 guns, but 4 guns. That's it. Including one gun, I love this story, from the Virginia Military Institute that had been put on loan to Pendleton. The day Pendleton lost that gun, VMI writes him and says, we need our gun back.
Oh,
like, that's awesome.
No.
Yeah, that's bad, right?
Awesome.
He's like about that, guys.
Yeah, I know. Another guy, Union Brigade Commander Charles Griffin, who was an artillery commander at 1st Manassas, lost his gun, lost most of his guns at 1st Manassas.
Yep.
When the 62nd Pennsylvania brought one of these captured Confederate guns back, he recognized it as one of his guns that he had lost in his command at 1st Manassas.
That's like losing a puppy and then finding it again.
Yeah, right?
What a joyous moment for
Griffin.
14
months later, yeah. And apparently, for Griffin, it was said he wouldn't shut up about this for like weeks on end.
Dude, I'd be pumped.
Yeah, I know, right? Absolutely.
I would do nothing but wreak hell upon my enemies with it. Be like, you gave me it back, now you're done. Canister, canister.
So, fun fact, that gun is put back in Battery D of the 5th U.S. Artillery, and it was probably on top of Little Round Top as well on July 2nd, 1860.
Wow.
Haven't been able to prove that. And funner fact, the gun's still around. It's up in western New York.
I was gonna say, do we know where it is?
Yeah. Yep. I visited a couple times.
God,
It's only about 20 miles from where I grew up.
When you can
That's
track
awesome.
Yeah.
a piece from the war like that, that's incredible.
That was cool. That was late nights.
By
in
the way,
library.
you mentioned
I have no-
sort of close to where you grew up.
Yeah.
Buffalo guy. Are you okay?
Go Bills.
I mean, it's saying, are you okay? I mean,
Right
I know
now I am.
It's been a while.
Lifelong, I'm not.
But I
yeah,
just, it was a
just,
hard.
Just give me one championship.
Now that
that's all I
football's
need.
back, it was a hard ending for you. So
It
I
was.
didn't know if you were okay.
I've recovered.
I love you,
I got a
buddy.
6-pack waiting for me at home. No.
There you go.
Yeah. So where were we? Buffalo Bills. No. So
4 guns.
Yeah, 4 guns. All right. So the Federals find 4 guns. They'd also during the night captured some prisoners, and those prisoners had told Fitzjohn Porter after he started interrogating them that the Confederate Army was in a bad situation.
Okay.
And so Porter decided that night, early the next morning, that he wanted to do a reconnaissance across the river to figure out where the Confederate Army was and what state it was in. He wrote to McClellan asking for permission. I've never found any evidence that McClellan wrote back to him and said sure, but Porter went ahead and did it. And I'm sure it was approved by McClellan ultimately. But McClellan ordered up, it had to have been, because he ordered Pleasanton to be at the river by the morning. Because you think of a reconnaissance into hostile territory, you want cavalry going first, right?
Right.
Okay, yeah. Well, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 a.m. rolls around, no cavalry, north bank of the river. They had missed their wagons on their way back to camp after Porter shuttled them back towards Keedysville. So they missed their food. They were late getting started. They didn't show up until after all this is underway. So Porter decided to go forward. Overall, the operation was under the command of George Sykes, and he had 2 brigades part of this operation. One was under the command of Charles Lovell. It was all United States regulars. Their job goes south on the Charlestown Road or Trough Road, figure out where the Confederates are in that direction. And then a volunteer brigade under the command of James Barnes, which was 2 Massachusetts regiments, 2 New York regiments, 1 from Maine, 1 from some state that looks like a hand.
Is there a weird mitten?
Yeah, mitten, I guess.
Mitten?
Mitten, that's
thanks.
better. Yeah. And then a brand new regiment, all of those
Which way
units.
does the mitten go? This way? If we're at the
Oh, there
camp,
you
but
go.
if the
Okay.
camera.
Ooh,
Yeah, if you're
that's a
at the
good question.
camera.
Oh,
The
all right, there you
mitten.
go. The mitten, the Michigan mitten.
The important stuff, guys.
That's right, absolutely, yeah. So those 6 regiments were all veterans. They'd seen fighting on the peninsula, Second Manassas, and then you have the 118th Pennsylvania, guys that have never loaded their guns before.
Yeah.
The
Cross
Corn
over the river.
Exchange
Corn
Regiment.
Exchange Regiment, absolutely. So they cross the river. Then Barnes's task is to head west toward Shepherdstown, figure out what's in that direction. Now all this will be supported. You thought 44 guns was impressive. Porter is able to line up, and Henry Hunt, 55 artillery pieces on the north bank of the river.
Love me some Henry Hunt.
Yep,
Love
absolutely.
That artillery
So-
commander.
Henry Hunt's getting ready for Fredericksburg. He's
Yeah,
like, I don't know it
yep,
yet,
absolutely.
but I need to practice big gun operations.
This is the largest concentration of federal artillery. It's even larger than what's on the front line at Melbourne Hill.
That's
July 1st,
impressive.
1862, yeah. So this is a very large concentration of federal artillery that they have up there. So Lovell crosses, he goes south, runs into the van of Robert E. Lee's army. Because what Lee has done, thinking all 44 guns are lost, and having a unknown federal force in his rear, he doesn't know the size of it, Lee decides to halt his movement towards Williamsport, and he turns most of his army around to come back here towards Shepherdstown. In the front, the 3,000-man division of A.P. Hill.
Right.
Probably the best troops in the Army of Northern Virginia at this point.
Certainly the freshest.
Yeah, true, absolutely. So Lovell runs into them about a mile south of the river, and Lovell says, we got a lot of guys out in front of us.
Nope.
We're pulling back. George Sykes looks around. You can't see it here, but I encourage you to come down to the Shepherdstown battlefield and check it out. The bluffs aren't even bluffs, they're cliffs. They're cliffs here, and Sykes says this is no place to fight a defensive battle. So he orders Lovell back, orders Lovell to recross the river, and in the meantime, to cover Lovell's withdrawal, he's going to order Barnes's brigade up on top of the bluffs to cover him. So Barnes's men deploy, they get into positions. They don't stay for all that very long. They will fight some of A.P. Hill's front line, but ultimately, then Barnes is going to receive orders to pull back as well. Barnes's brigade, the entirety of Barnes's brigade, did pull back. I got like the Loch Ness Monster coming up behind
Oh,
me.
you're in the
I'm-
water.
I am in the water. Yeah, I saw you guys slowly backing away. I thought
I was
something-
like, just
something-
get out of the water. I was trying to do
coming
it
up to
discreetly.
grab me.
Our man
Oh.
wandered into the water.
I told you I was going to do that. I told you it was going to happen. So Barnes, 6 of Barnes' 7 regiments pull back. The only ones that don't, 118th Pennsylvania.
Right.
Through a miscommunication of orders.
Oh, no.
These guys are brand new. Literally, as they deploy, one of Hill's brigade commanders thought that it was an entire new federal brigade showing up on the field. So he called for help. They start lapping around the right end of the 118th Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvanians also, some of their guns were not working, they were malfunctioning, so they're not able to shoot. Long story short, the Pennsylvanians get driven off the bluffs. They are forced down a ravine, and in some cases over the cliffside, jumping down onto the road from there. And then as they recross the river down at the mill dam, which you might be able to see behind us here,
A
not
little
quite
bit of
halfway.
ripple out there. You might be able to make it out.
Just beyond this little island here that we have behind us. And as they're withdrawing, Confederate troops have lined the bluffs here, and they're shooting down at the Pennsylvanians as they're trying to escape. Some of the Pennsylvanians go into the archways of the lime kilns to seek cover. One Federal artillery shell lands short and lands in one of those kilns and explodes. So it's a very messy withdrawal. But by mid-morning, this whole thing is over. Hill's division is going to remain in its positions on the bluff for the rest of the day to make sure the Federals don't come back across. But the Pennsylvanians are going to be left in the dry bed of the canal, looking at that field of where they suffered nearly 270 casualties in their first fight. Not a good sight for them.
Devastating.
Yes, yep. So this is a terrible baptism of fire for them. But really, I mean, weirdly enough, the last battle of the Maryland campaign is a Confederate battlefield victory.
Yeah.
But it stops Lee's campaign.
Yeah.
And let me explain how. When Lee turned his army around to come to Shepherdstown and then turned them back around to continue going up towards Williamsport, his army just started to break apart at the seams. I mean, it's already been doing that.
In the tank.
Yes,
Was it.
yep. As I'm sure you guys have talked about, it's already been doing that for the last 2 weeks. But now it's gotten to the point where his army isn't even functioning the way an army should function.
Right.
So that happens, and then also the next day, September 21st, Lee finds out that Jeb Stuart's been kicked out of Maryland and driven back into Virginia.
Darius Couch.
Darius
or
Couch.
Couch, however you want to pronounce it.
Pennsylvania militia, William Franklin.
Darius and Couch.
Yeah, there you go.
Love you.
What is his middle name? Oh, Nash. That's right.
Yep.
Nash.
Nash.
Yeah.
Darius
Yep.
Nash Couch.
Yep. That's right.
With
so
the remains of
Nash
the fourth.
Couch?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
With the remains of the Fourth Corps.
Yes. Yep. That's right. So Stuart's bridgehead is gone. Lee's bridgehead into Maryland is gone, and so ultimately he will decide that his army just can't function. It can't recross the river into Maryland, and so Lee decides it's time to end his campaign. McClellan does very much the same thing, recognizing that Lee's army here is still a dangerous army that has to be dealt with. He decides not to continue the pursuit across the Potomac River, believing that his goals have been achieved of driving the enemy out of Maryland and back into Virginia. And so, by almost mutual consent, they never shook hands on this, but the two armies took some time off to rest, refit, and get ready for the next campaign. And that starts with the Battle of Shepherdstown here.
Well, Kevin, I want to thank you for coming back on the show here in the visual from the field format and taking us through the final actions of this tumultuous 3 weeks, this critical 3 weeks in American military and national history, considering what this campaign does for the political system moving forward and what it transforms, our nation into this, day. If you want to sort of pick things up from this moment in the war, we did Fredericksburg. I think it was last season or the season before, but in the stuff for the Battle of Fredericksburg, we covered what happens after Antietam. You want to tell our
Valley campaign.
Tell our listeners in short sense what's going to happen and why they should go to our YouTube channel and keep watching this.
Well, the next campaign following the Maryland campaign of '62 is one that we don't hear much about, but something that Kevin and I have done a lot of research on. The Second Virginia campaign for McClellan, also known as the Loudoun Valley. Federal forces cross over the Potomac and begin what is looking to be a fairly successful operation against Confederate forces as they are driving through the Loudoun Valley, attempting to get in between the two wings of Lee's army, what would soon be known as corps of Lee's army. This operation will lead to the eventual removal of George McClellan and an army commander change for the Army of the Potomac. Of course, Ambrose Burnside being brought to the fore at that point, and the campaign for Fredericksburg would begin shortly thereafter.
So that stuff is available on our YouTube channel as well. So when you're done watching this, get yourself a cup of water, take a breather. We know it's been a long couple weeks. We thank you all for hanging out with us as we followed the Maryland campaign through its 160th commemorative. Come out and see Kevin. Where can we find you in the field for the rest of this year, big guy?
At Antietam. basically. I mean, I'll be there giving tours. I'm around, so you'll find me.
You'll see him with the Bills Mafia breaking
That's right,
tables
breaking
on Sundays.
tables. There you go. That's right.
Make sure to follow us on all of our social media, Facebook and Instagram, by following the History Things Podcast. Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. 5-star ratings and reviews, best way to help us on the podcast
Always
itself.
appreciate it.
And always, first of every quarter, you're going to find something big and special from us. So we thank you all for listening, and we will catch you all next time.
Good night.